Welcome to the podcast about investing in startups, where existing investors can learn how to get the best deal possible. And those that have never before invested in startups can learn the keys to success from the venture experts. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Welcome to another special release of Investor Stories. On this installment, the experts discuss a startup that they did not invest in, why they passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs their approach. Here's the segment called Why I Passed. On today's special segment, we have David Brown. David, can you tell me a story about a startup that you decided not to invest in, why it was that you passed, and what you learned that now informs your approach?
That's a hard question because, unfortunately, at Techstars, we get 12 to 15,000 applications a year, and we're only able to invest in 100. So The rate of acceptance, the rate of investment is 1%. And so it's not that the ones that we pass on are necessarily bad ideas. It's just we can only pick a few, and we'll give feedback to those that aren't great investments. But really, it's not about saying no. It's just can't say yes to everybody.
Yeah, sure. Are there certain key variables that seem to come up more often than others that sort of lead to a pass?
Yeah, our criteria, only half jokingly, we have 6 criteria. They're team, market progress, idea. So team is this idea is nothing matters more than the people. So it's our strong belief that great people with mediocre ideas are much more likely to be successful than mediocre people with great ideas. So team matters more than anything else, really, as much as everything else put together. Market is this notion that are you going after something big, or if you're really, really successful, at most you're only going to get 5 customers. Unless those are multi-million-dollar customers, it's probably not likely to be a large market. Progress is the ability to get stuff done. Can you move from A to B over a period of time, or have you and your co-founder had this great idea for a startup for 5 years and you don't have a product, you don't have a customer, you don't even have a website, then you sort of fail the progress. And then idea is sort of deliberately last, because a lot of the companies that come through Techstars wind up pivoting. And we don't want to lock in too much as the idea is the top criteria, and that is natural human tendency to think about the idea.
Speaking of progress, we recently had Steve Blank on the program, and he talked about how he sort of puts these early startups into a cohort before an investment and monitors their progress over time before deciding to make an investment. I'm kind of curious about some of the startups that don't make the cut at Techstars. Do you ever make a note of some that have tremendous potential, but for some reason they may not be in the right place for the upcoming cohort? And do you track their progress and then take another pass at them for the next round?
Yeah, we do. I actually have 2 ways of answering that question. So the first is we do absolutely keep in touch. And there's a lot of stories of companies that applied 2 or even 3 times before they've gotten in. They just weren't ready the first time round. And we said, go show some progress, come back, and they go away, they show progress, and they come back, and then we accept them into a subsequent cohort. So that happens a lot. The second thing that happens a lot is that sometimes a company that applies to Techstars Location 1 is more applicable for Techstars Location 2. So maybe they're in a particular vertical, and it's, say, with one of our partners like Disney or Barclays or Sprint or whatever. And so we may recommend that they apply to a different type of Techstars, a different location of Techstars. So that happens. And I guess the third point I wanted to make is really we are doing what you described in that we're making a modest investment, and through our fund, we continue and do follow-on investments in some of the companies that have been through Techstars, after they've proven themselves.
For today's Investor Stories segment, we have Steve Blank. Steve, can you tell us a story about a startup that you chose not to invest in, why it was that you passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs your approach?
Wow. Well, I do this as a hobby, not as a business. So, I tend to invest in my students just sometimes to keep score. It's the wrong guy to ask that question. If I can, I'll turn the question around and tell you a story about a VC who passed on me who then told me later a lesson he learned. Would that be?
Yeah, that's right.
So, I did 8 startups in 21 years, and my next to last company was a video game company called Rocket Science Games. And I learned a couple of important lessons on that one. I blew through $35 million of other people's money. In fact, it was so depressing. I was on the cover of Wired magazine, and 90 days later, I realized I was running out of money and going to crater the company. And when I did, I called my mother and said, I lost $35 million. My mother, English wasn't her first language. I'm a first-generation American. She came from Russia. And so she had to translate, everything I said in her head. And so her response was, when I said I lost $35 million, she said, "Where'd you put it?" And I said, no, it's gone. And then she she broke into Russian and Polish and Yiddish, and she said 2 things. One is, there's no country for us to go back to. It's gone. It was Lithuania. And then 2 is, she said, "Oh my God, our name's blank. We can't even change it." And luckily by this time I had raised another $12 million for my next startup. And I said, "No, Mom, I just want to tell you those same folks gave me more money."
Unreal. Unreal.
Then she said, the streets are paved with gold. And I tell the story not because it's a Steve Blank story. It's in fact an entrepreneurship story about Silicon Valley, is that you're an entrepreneurial cluster when the word for a failed entrepreneur is experienced. It's a big idea. We, in fact, treat failure here, an honest failure, as experience. The good news is about investors, and you and your investor audience should think about the entrepreneurs they go after. Yeah, you might not return their call after 3 or 4 failures in a row, but one doesn't knock you out of the game. And that, in fact, is what makes this area great. We take that for granted. Other places in the world, you truly do have to change your name, and you're worried about people going to go break your kneecaps for, losing their money. That's what makes this cluster great. It's not just the great entrepreneurs. It's, in fact, we have an entrepreneurial investor culture here that's equally insane. The reason why Silicon Valley beat Boston, which wasn't clear when I came out in the 1970s, is in the late 1970s when the pension funds were able to invest, and the amount of capital started just by a factor of 10, if not 100. Boston still decided to act like bankers. But Silicon Valley investors, the Kleiners and the Sequoias, they started to act like goddamn pirates. And at the end of the day, the pirates won. And we built a risk-taking financial culture here that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And I think the wisdom of that is evident of why we're the preeminent center of investing.
On our special segment series today, we have Dave Burgess. Dave, can you tell us a story about a startup that you chose not to invest in, why it was that you passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs your approach?
Well, I have a story. Mine is just one of many that happened because as an early investor, I had rules that I created for myself. And one of those rules was I had an airplane, a twin-engine airplane. And even though, fuel at that time was nowhere near what it is today, my rule was that I wanted to invest in a company that was close enough to be able to get to and from easily. So for me, that was a 200 or 300 mile radius from where I am, which is Los Angeles. And so I had a former employee who was my chief programmer of that second Inc. 500 company. And he left me because he wanted to be a marketing person. And I couldn't let him do that. He had 26 programmers working for him. And he was responsible for thousands of hotels who looked to him for the vision that developed new software that gave them the competitive edge. But he wouldn't listen. And he left me in 1990. Remember, I began investing in 93. So he disappeared. And even though he was a close friend, I hadn't heard from him during those 5 years. And suddenly, on August 26, 1995, I received an email from him, which I keep today. I have it on my desk right now, and I'm going to read you a little bit from it. And he had written this email to my AOL.com address. And for those of us who are sophisticated, we really have long since left AOL.com behind as our email address. So it kind of tells you how long ago it was. So I'm going to read you just a couple of sentences from it.
Yeah.
His name was Tom Schoenoff, and he knows about this. Just a month or two ago, I sent him a copy of this letter because he had forgotten, what he had said when he sent it. Hello again, Dave. After looking around rather a lot, I've ended up as employee number 7 at a Seattle-based internet retail startup called Amazon.com. Tom had turned out to be the head of marketing for this brand new company, and this was in its first 2 weeks of operation. And the surprise to me is I had already heard about Amazon, and I had already ordered my first book, so I knew about the company. I didn't think very much of it at the time. It was just a good idea. And Tom said, I'm looking at my stock options and counting the days. You really ought to look at what we're doing. The founder, Jeff, is in round 2 of quote, capital seeking. And if I had the minimum 100,000, I'd buy in. This from a cautious and naturally dubious insider. If you'd like me to introduce you to Jeff, I'm sure he'd take your money.
You're
Sincerely, Tom.
Me. Wow.
And so I wrote him back, remember my rules. Seattle isn't close to Los Angeles. And I said,
no.
Gee, Tom, great to hear from you. Keep me informed. And so I asked my audiences when I can show them the letter, actually show the original letter, which I printed out that day. I asked them how much the 100,000 would be worth 2 years later at the Amazon public offering in 1997. And so, Nick, why don't you take a guess? You're my audience for the day. 100,000 2 years later, Amazon's public offering was worth?
2 years later. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to guess 20 million.
33. Now, you know that private investors are required to hold on for another 6 months before they're allowed to sell their shares so that the public market isn't inundated by these investors' shares.
Right.
But for the fun of it, let's say we held on for one more year. Now it's 1998, August 1998. What would that 33 million have been worth?
120?
Oh, that's good. No, 66.
Yeah.
Now, I should have prepared the real number for today, but nobody would have held on to it from 1995 until today, so it's not a fair test at all. But 100 to 66 million. And I said, gee, Tom, keep me informed.
Wow.
Well, today during this bubble, you're going to hear people say that they passed on some of these great companies that are in the bubble right now in the Silicon Valley. And they'll tell you numbers that are bigger than this. So my number isn't spectacular, but it does say that you are going to be exposed to some deals that seem either outlandish or outside of your investment profile, and you're going to walk from them. And you just have to know, as I titled my TEDx talk, you can smile at your successes, but you better laugh at your failures.
So do you still have the twin engine 200-mile rule?
I sold the plane, I think about 7 or 8 years ago. You got to remember that fuel went from $2.50 to $7 per gallon. And this plane was eating 36 gallons an hour just in regular flight, let alone climb. And so as I looked at my investment portfolio, it wasn't worth the price of the plane. And I miss it tremendously, but it was nice for 43 years as I flew for that time.
That will wrap up this installment of Investor Stories. Head over to thefullratchet.net to leave a comment, sign up for the newsletter, or find resources discussed on any of the episodes. Until next time, remember to over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for listening.